our last episode, we explored how Franz Joseph's empire outwardly modernized yet inwardly decayed, fractured by nationalism and paralyzed by the very compromise meant to save it. But as tensions simmered across the empire, another crisis was brewing, one not in the halls of parliament, but in the emperor's own family. This is Road to Destruction, the World Wars. Crown Prince Rudolf was born in 1858, the only son of Franz Joseph and Empress Elizabeth. He was Austria's future, the bright, modern prince who many hoped would reform the empire. But from an early age, Rudolf's life was marked by conflict. From the earliest years of his life, Rudolf was kept at a distance from his father, both physically and emotionally. He spent long stretches away from the Hofburg Palace, growing up in remote imperial residences like Laxenburg Castle, or at times even more isolated estates, under the care of governesses and tutors rather than his parents. Franz Joseph, devoted to duty and protocol, rarely took time to nurture or guide his son personally. This distance was not merely the result of busy schedules, it was part of a rigid court tradition that treated royal children as future instruments of statecraft, not as sons or daughters needing affection. While Rudolf's mother, Empress Elizabeth, occasionally intervened to ensure he received a modern, liberal education, Franz Joseph's aloofness left a deep void. This absence of paternal warmth hardened Rudolf's sense of alienation and made him more receptive to new ideas, and increasingly resentful of the empire's stifling conservatism. While Franz Joseph insisted on strict military discipline, Empress Elizabeth ensured Rudolf also received instruction from liberal tutors, who introduced him to modern science and progressive political thought. This duality created a young prince torn between the empire's traditions and the new ideas sweeping Europe. By the time he reached adolescence, Rudolf had become a young man defined as much by the chasm between himself and his father as by his own restless ambitions. His liberal ideas clashed bitterly with his father's rigid conservatism. He admired constitutionalism, science, and free thought. Franz Joseph believed in divine right, military order, and Habsburg tradition. Rudolf was openly questioning absolutism and championing reforms that horrified his father and his court, setting the stage for the rift that would define his short, tragic life. Their relationship became a quiet battlefield. At dinners, they argued politics. In letters, they accused each other of ignorance. And behind closed doors, they spoke less and less. Franz Joseph hoped Rudolf would grow out of what he saw as youthful rebellion. But as the prince aged, his disappointment in the empire and in his father only deepened. Rudolf's personal life mirrored his political frustrations. His marriage to Princess Stephanie of Belgium quickly soured. The match was cold and arranged. The couple drifted apart, unable to find common ground. By his late 20s, Rudolf was a restless, deeply troubled man. He drank heavily, fell into bouts of depression, and sought escape in affairs. One of those affairs was with Baroness Mary Wetzera, a 17-year-old noblewoman who became the object of Rudolf's obsessive affection. Their relationship spiraled beyond scandal. It became an all-consuming fixation. Friends warned that Rudolf's despair was growing dangerous. Court officials worried what might happen if the heir to the empire acted on his darkest thoughts. But in the vast gilded halls of the Hofburg, whispers were easy to ignore. On January 29, 1889, Rudolf and Mary traveled to his hunting lodge in Mayerling, a quiet village outside Vienna. The next morning, both were found dead. Mary had been shot. Rudolf had a fatal bullet wound to his head. The official announcement described it as a murder-suicide pact, a desperate escape from a world they believed offered them no place. But the imperial court's response was immediate and severe. Rumors flew of a cover-up, that Rudolf had been assassinated, or that he had murdered Mary before taking his own life. The Hofburg was thrown into chaos. Ministers debated how much truth to release. Church authorities demanded a story that would allow Rudolf a Catholic burial. In the end, it was declared that Rudolf had been in a state of mental imbalance. It was enough to grant him a resting place in the imperial crypt, but it couldn't bury the scandal. For Franz Joseph, the news was a hammer blow. His only son, his heir, his hope for the empire's future, gone in an instant. The emperor was 58 years old and already weary from decades of crisis. The Mayerling tragedy seemed to confirm his deepest fear, that the Habsburg legacy was cursed. He spent days in silence, pacing the palace halls. Ministers reported that he barely ate or slept. When he did speak, it was only to ask, over and over, why? He received condolences from across Europe, but they rang hollow. Friends noted that Franz Joseph aged visibly in the weeks after Mayerling. His face grew more lined, his gaze more distant. The empire noticed. Newspapers abroad speculated whether Austria-Hungary could survive with its future so uncertain. Vienna's streets filled with hushed crowds as Rudolf's funeral procession wound through the city, and in every province, from Galicia to Dalmatia, subjects whispered, if the Habsburg heir could not bear the weight of empire, who could? Rudolf's death left a chasm in the line of succession. Franz Joseph had no other surviving sons. The next in line became his nephew, Archduke Karl Ludwig, an aging, uninspiring figure who showed little aptitude for leadership. And after Karl Ludwig, succession would pass to his son, Archduke Franz Ferdinand. But even as Europe's great powers watched Austria's royal family with new skepticism, Franz Joseph tried to carry on. He buried himself in work, reading reports late into the night and issuing decrees with mechanical precision. To many, it seemed the emperor was attempting to govern not out of hope, but out of stubborn refusal to surrender. Mayerling cast a long shadow. Within Austria-Hungary, it became a symbol of imperial decline, proof that the monarchy was crumbling not only on the outside but from within. Franz Joseph's personal tragedy became the empire's political wound. Rudolf's liberal ideals had inspired many reform-minded Austrians, Hungarians and Czechs. His death was seen by them as a final blow to hopes of gradual change. Without him, conservative forces around Franz Joseph reasserted themselves. The emperor himself, shaken and isolated, doubled down on caution. Parliamentary reform proposals stalled, minority grievances festered. Nationalist leaders who had once hoped for a future under a more progressive Habsburg heir began to look elsewhere, to independence, or to alliances with Austria's rivals. For years, figures in Czech, Slovak and Croatian circles had quietly placed their hopes in Rudolf's liberal sympathies, believing that patience and gradual reform could one day bring them more autonomy within the empire. His willingness to entertain federal ideas and his apparent disdain for his father's rigid conservatism offered a sliver of optimism to millions who felt excluded from the dual monarchy's narrow compromise. But with Rudolf's sudden death, that hope evaporated overnight. Many nationalists concluded that waiting for reform from within was futile, and that the only way forward was to break free entirely, or to seek support from neighboring powers like Russia or Italy. Mayerling had not only shattered a family but transformed simmering discontent into a more urgent and desperate quest for change, accelerating the empire's drift toward crisis. In the months after Mayerling, Franz Joseph's world grew quieter. His relationship with Empress Elizabeth, already strained, became colder still. Friends and family said he spoke less, smiled rarely, and seemed to carry the weight of a man who had lost his compass. Ministers continued to arrive each morning with papers to sign, but the emperor's eyes often seemed to look through them. He became a symbol of a dynasty out of time, a solitary, tragic figure presiding over a house that seemed destined to fall. Yet he kept going. In private moments, Franz Joseph confessed to confidants that he had nothing left but duty, and so he rose each morning, dressed in his immaculate uniform, and tried to hold the center of an empire growing more restless by the day. But Franz Joseph's trials were far from over. As he struggled to recover from his son's death, tragedy would strike again, this time even closer to his heart. In our next episode, Empress Elizabeth, Sisi, the heartbreak and murder of Austria's beloved empress. We explore how Sisi's restless spirit and violent end shattered what was left of the emperor's world and left Austria-Hungary more vulnerable than ever. This is Road to Destruction, the World Wars.